Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Did a live reality TV show help a man discover his wife's cheating or not? Today's story with a similar plot. Enjoy the show! We were both in the living room when the next show started, but it was becoming increasingly difficult and awkward to watch together. By now, we were in week 7, and all this time people had been pandering, hitting back, and voting for each other. The game continued, but like previous seasons, when I watched it with my wife, I didn't really care about any of the people, well, except for 3. This season, in addition, 8 people were eliminated from the show, meaning that anyone who voted for them did not go home but went to the House of Peers. Here, they would remain until the final show, where these 6 people would return to vote for one of the last 2 survivors to determine the winner. Sherry was thrilled to have made it this far, although I was less than happy about it, much less than happy about it, in fact. I was more convinced that her enthusiasm came from the fact that she had to spend more time living out some deep-seated fantasy with her boy toy than competing in the game. Didn't she see what she was doing? Fan of the show or not, she had long since crossed the line of what could be considered acceptable behavior for a faithful wife. Although I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it, I was able to eliminate one possible cause. It wasn't pure stupidity, because no one could be that stupid. Jake won the competition that week and earned the right to be head of house, which gave him the right to have his own room. My fears reached a new level as hope seemed to have completely left me. Believe it or not, things got worse. All was well until the end of that night's show. That's when the dive happened. While everyone was sitting in the back, Jake stood up, and I saw what this arrogant jerk had no use for. He stretched and then said he was tired and going to take a shower. He looked at my wife, raised an eyebrow, and winked. A moment later, Sherry agreed that a shower was a good idea and followed him inside. The other guests were stunned. The son of AB H stopped and let her catch up so they could walk through the house together, hugging each other. And here comes this damn chemistry again. Even though it broke my heart, even though I was thinking of them as a couple at this point, it was impossible not to. As soon as they closed the door behind them, the others immediately started talking about them. The network suddenly decided not to give out the words cheater but did use 1 or 2 adjectives said before them. Katie Ross appeared on camera to end the show and seemed upset about what had just happened. I assumed she was trying to remain impartial, but I thought I heard more than a hint of disapproval in her voice. Lynn and I were both on edge as we watched the show in near silence. It was like we were both waiting for the axe to fall, but if we hadn't talked about it, it wouldn't have happened. Good idea, even if it didn't work. That's how the network episode ended. When I switched to cable, my emotions were all over the place, and I wasn't sure I was ready to see what might happen next, but I couldn't resist. Like the rest of the show up to that point, I didn't want to watch, I just needed to know what was going on. Lynn was already sobbing. I had a really bad feeling before that night at the cable show, and apparently, Lynn did too, because after the show opened, she stood up, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "I'm feeling a little tired, Dad. I'm going to bed." In fact, I knew she would be watching it upstairs in her room. I didn't want her to do it, but she's a big girl now and has the right to watch if she wants. It was easy to see that she, like me, was afraid that something would happen tonight that a father and daughter should never watch together. The knot in my stomach was reaching incredible proportions, and I was sickened by the knowledge that what was happening could not be stopped and that there were thousands of miles between us. The cable show was about to start when I noticed that I was having trouble watching TV. I was glad Lynn went upstairs because I was already starting to cry. As I mentioned, what a nightmare. Sherry sat down on one of the shower chairs, still wearing the same skimpy white bikini she wore to the previous show. Jake was wearing swim trunks and a t-shirt, but when he took off his shirt, I thought Sherry's eyes were going to fall out of their sockets. I don't know why, she had seen him shirtless before, but maybe it was because this time they were all alone. I don't know. Jake then stepped into the shower and began running the water before disappearing behind a partial shower door that allowed viewers at home to see him from his knees to his chest or neck, depending on the person's height. He then looked at my wife and asked, "Would you like to join me?" She then asked, "What do you think my husband would say if I went into the shower with a young hottie like you?" Even though she mentioned her husband, she had no doubt that I was the last thing on her mind at that moment. I have no idea how this is even possible, but I witnessed it myself. The love-struck boy just grinned as she approached him. I began to shake my head, silently pleading out loud, "Oh my God, don't do this, baby. Please don't do this to me. We can still get through this if you stop now." Despite everything going on, I was still shocked to see Sherry accept Jake's invitation to take a shower. A moment later, she came in and closed the door. Almost immediately, Jake took off his swim trunks, hung them over the door, and pulled Sherry toward him, inviting her to take off her bikini. She initially refused, fearing that someone might see them in the shower together. The way I thought about it was that the other 6 people were still outside, so Sherry wouldn't have to worry about them. Of course, her daughter and husband would see, as well as the rest of the United States and anyone else in the world who had a companion, but other than that, she had no reason to be embarrassed. It was also alarming that, at that time, this was her only fear. Sherry pulled away, but only to do what I thought was unthinkable. I started begging again to no one in particular, "Oh God, honey, please stop. Please don't do this to us." I couldn't see what he was doing, but he must have tried something because Sherry said, "No, not here, someone might catch us. How about we finish and go to my room?" She looked into his eyes and smiled sweetly, as she had done to me millions of times over the years, and quietly said, "Okay, but just hold me for a few minutes." They got out of the shower and went to Jake's room. He crawled under the blanket and, smiling at my wife, asked if she was cold. She smiled sweetly, a smile that was once unique to me, and quietly replied in an almost childlike voice, "A little." It became clear to me that the cameras and microphones were pointed at my wife and her lover, almost as if they were having their own show. Probably when under stress, a person thinks about the stupidest things. At first, it was just cuddling and talking under the covers, Sherry telling Jake everything about me, her faithful husband. Unfortunately, the man steered the conversation in the direction he wanted. Unsurprisingly, she didn't point out that I worked hard to provide for my family, that I coached kids in baseball and hockey in my rare free time, and that I fulfilled almost all of her wishes with a smile. Instead, she said that I didn't always support her emotionally. What does this even mean? We always talked to each other about what we did that day or how we felt about any issue one of us brought up. Did I really need to get a degree in psychiatry to better care for her emotional needs? Where did this even come from? Did they at some point replace my wife with this imposter? Then she said that I was not as intimate with her as she would like. I had tried many times to rekindle passion, only to hear that she was too tired or that she was not up to it today. In fact, from before the start of the show, it had been several months since we had been intimate. Again, it's not like I didn't try. Now, I'm not young. I would like to say that I am no longer young, but in fact, I never was. I've always been average. However, she never complained until now, and she put all the blame on me. You might think, well, if you weren't the man of her dreams, maybe that was the problem. But even as an ordinary guy with extremely limited intimate abilities, did I deserve all this? She continued to say that she wished I could spend as much time with her as Jake did. I wonder why that is. How can he spend so much time with her, and I can't? Probably because they're locked in this damn house together, and they have nothing better to do than try to get my wife. Not to mention, the lover doesn't have to mow the lawn or shovel snow in the winter. He doesn't have to go to parent-teacher conferences or fix things around the house. And there are some other things I can't remember. Oh yeah, I need to work 8 or more hours a day to support my family. It didn't seem to matter much in my wife's eyes. It was even harder to realize that if she could betray me so easily, perhaps I had never mattered much in her eyes. They both spoke in low voices, and I began to feel nauseous again, realizing that this intimacy was usually just between Sherry and me. But now I began to realize that many of those things that were reserved for just the two of us no longer mattered. It was in these quiet tones that my world began to completely collapse. Jake asked, "You don't seem happy with your husband, do you?" She giggled a little and hesitated, and I wanted to believe that she would be too embarrassed to answer the question. Although by this point, I already had a pretty good idea of what the answer would be if she answered honestly. Instead, she quietly replied, "Yes, mostly." I noticed that she hesitated again, as if she didn't want to go into detail. It should have been obvious because even the idiot noticed it. "What were you going to say?" he asked in a concerned voice that certainly didn't match the level of concern he actually felt for her. This smug man. She started to blush and replied, "Listen, I don't feel comfortable saying that. What if Walt or my daughter sees this?" She must have thought that the shower was just to follow the old expression that cleanliness is the closest thing to godliness. Maybe she thought taking a shower with him amounted to a religious experience, and I would accept that gratefully. Speaking for myself, I know I kept repeating God's name while I was watching. Of course, I added things like, "God, no. God, please stop," and the popular "damn you." The ladies' man smiled even wider as he replied, "How can they see that? How can anyone see this? We are locked here in the leader's room, safe from the others. Believe me, they don't suspect a thing." She giggled nervously and replied, "What about television, idiot?" Ah, their first fight, I thought. Maybe they will find a way to make peace. I'm sure my buddy Jake will come up with something. He pretended to be offended, and she giggled again. If it weren't for the situation, her laugh would have been cute. "You're safe, Sherry. They never show such things, they can't. The kids are watching, so we can talk about anything." He paused for a moment, raising an eyebrow and showing a sinister smile, and said, "We can also do whatever we want, and no one will know. Are you sure about this?" "Of course I'm sure. You said you watched every episode of the show, right?" "Yes," she answered, but it was drawn out and sounded more like a question, as if she wasn't entirely sure she believed him. "Do you really think this is the first time a married woman has been romantically involved with another man, a man who loves her more than her husband? Are you saying you love me?" "What do you think?" She smiled and blushed. He didn't even say he loved her. It would be a lie if he did. He didn't love her and probably couldn't, because the idiot had never loved anyone in his life. He was just using her, playing on her feelings to get what he wanted, even though she couldn't see it. It was clear from the look on her face that she thought she heard it. She only heard what she wanted to hear, and in her mind, she heard him say he loved her. She was lost in the moment and lost in her fantasy. I wanted to jump through the TV screen and shake her, so she would come to her senses. This guy was terribly cunning, but he was still a piece of. Jake made the most of his time, having Sherry trapped with him while keeping me trapped at the same time. I was trapped because he knew I would watch him slowly seduce my wife, and it gave him the perfect opportunity to humiliate me, using my complete powerlessness to his advantage. He asked her in a loving and caring tone, "Is he good in bed? I mean, is he really doing this for you? This man really was a romantic devil, wasn't he?" She didn't answer right away, although she finally said, "Well, he thinks he's good in bed, and he tries really hard." She paused before continuing, "Don't get me wrong, he's very sweet and wants what's best. He's just not good enough most of the time." I just sat there, staring at the TV. My emotions were all over the place, but I didn't have time to process it all before they continued their assault on my soul. To make matters worse, it was clear from the movement and the pace of it that something was happening that clearly should not have happened to a wife or anyone other than her husband. They continued to speak in low voices, but the microphones picked it up as clearly as if she were shouting from the top of a mountain. Did she hate me? I thought about it. My anger was enormous at that moment and competed with the deep sadness that was tearing my heart apart. Jake then told her that he was close but didn't want to sleep on a wet spot. Once again, I began silently begging the empty room, "Please stop, honey, don't add salt to the open wound." The favor she had just provided to her lover was something she had never done for me, because she always said it was disgusting, not that it was on my mind at the time, but I think it's worth mentioning now. Even with Sherry's betrayal, I couldn't help but feel a little bad for her. Oh sure, there was a part of me that wanted to strangle her, but I couldn't help but think about what everyone would think of her later and what she would have to deal with for the rest of her life. People will whisper behind her back, and she will have to face her family and friends, most of whom are conservative like me. As I said before, the worst thing for me was that I could do nothing but watch as my main reason for living betrayed me. She didn't know it yet, but our marriage was no longer collapsing, it was over. Even though I didn't want it, life went on and the sun rose on a new day. I cried all night, or rather the little time that I slept, but by lunchtime, my decisions had already been made. The decisions themselves were quite simple because of Sherry's actions. The hard part was living with these decisions and making them. I never expected this to happen to my marriage, so I felt like a ship caught in a storm on the ocean. I was completely lost and didn't know where to go. I needed help and support from those who were willing to help. One of the things I had to do was leave before Sherry returned. I had time, of course, because even if she was kicked out of the house, she would still have to stay until the final show in that house of feasts or whatever they call it. That last show was almost a month away. I needed to leave. I couldn't face her, and I certainly didn't want to talk to her ever again. I was willing to do whatever it took to distance myself from all of this, but it wasn't just about getting away from Sherry. Because of her, I needed to get away from almost everything and everyone associated with my soon-to-be former life. My daughter Lynn was the only exception to my desire to leave everything behind, but ironically, we were still to be separated regardless of the distance between us. I intended to talk to her as often as she would allow me. My first conversation was with Lynn. I told her I might be leaving soon and asked if she wouldn't mind staying with her friend Debbie, if her parents didn't mind. They could go to school together in Maine in a few weeks. I then spoke with my boss and asked for a transfer to our office in Dan, Florida. This was one of the many things I needed help with, and luckily, my boss accommodated me. He not only arranged the transfer but also organized housing for me. He never said it outright, but it was obvious that he was probably watching the show with his wife, and his willingness to help me in any way he could came from putting himself in my shoes. I really couldn't thank him enough, and I told him so. I then spoke with a lawyer to discuss many other details. He turned out to be a pretty good guy. I know, I was surprised too. We talked about divorce, and he was shocked to learn that, other than a few thousand to start a new life, I was leaving the marriage with nothing. I just wanted to get out of it and give her the house, her car, and all of our savings, which amounted to several hundred. It seemed a fair price to me. Everything was paid off, so she and her new lover would be provided for the rest of their lives and could live happily, completing her fantastic life. You may ask why I didn't try to destroy her the way she destroyed me. Well, it's simple. I still loved her and always will. I think that was the most painful thing, to love someone as much as I do and, at the same time, hate her almost as much, if not more. I was also well aware that my approach to the divorce was the worst choice I could have made, but if it meant she wouldn't fight it and I'd never see her face again, then it would be money well spent. My proposal obviously did not suit her, but not because of finances. I'm getting ahead of myself a little. We will return to this issue later. It was time to play hardball on the net, and my first shot went straight to Zach Bevan's head. Why try to scare him when you can hit him on the head right away? I told my lawyer my idea, and when he finished laughing, he said it could work, although he was the first to admit that the entertainment industry was a completely different world. I assured him that he was my man and I wanted him to handle any possible settlement. But a lawsuit, and I mean a high-profile lawsuit, would be the last resort. Now is the time to try to negotiate a deal with the show's producer, something that would make the network, Lynn, and me happy. My idea was far from a guarantee, but it was worth a try. One of the downsides was that Lynn could still be married to Lynn and me for leaving the living room in front of the cameras recently. If he held a grudge, he could have just told me to shove my deal up my fifth place. Believe me, I wanted to hit them as hard as possible, but I knew my best chance was to stay realistic. Any threat of a lawsuit would likely remain just that, a threat. They had too much power for me to stand up to them, and even if I had a good case, they could drag it out in the courts for the next 50 years. Not to mention, the legal costs would be astronomical. So, my legal team, my team of one, advised me to ask for a reasonable amount and said they probably wouldn't be found liable. Basically, I was going to take what was offered to me. My lawyer said that Bevan, the same producer who showed my wife's fall on the national stage, and the Eaton Network actually agreed in principle to my proposal within an hour. One of the things that made us successful was that my lawyer mentioned I could always go on talk shows and basically criticize the highest-rated show in America. They were actually afraid that I would carry out what they thought was a fairly innocent threat. Hey, what works, right? But what really caught their attention was my idea that would send their precious ratings through the roof. My lawyer said that when Bevan heard my proposal, he was practically delighted. We had to come up with a few backup plans in case the game didn't go the way we wanted, although we ended up going with Plan A. That's the only thing that's gone right since this whole thing started. Oh yeah, and the network actually agreed to bribe me, that is, reward me, with $800,000 and pay for my daughter's college education, as long as I didn't file an individual lawsuit and name Bevan or the network in a future lawsuit. To be fair, it was probably still a drop in the bucket for the network, although I found it ironic that Sherry went on the show to win $500,000, and I received a check for $300,000 more than that. Don't get me wrong, money won't make up for my lost marriage and humiliation in front of the nation by any means, but it's better than nothing, and it will help me get settled in Florida and start my new single life. Mind you, my ultimate dream would be to go back in time and get my old life back. I had a lot of things to do that kept me busy, but I still felt like hell. The network show didn't air the next night, so not many people were going to see the upcoming spectacle. Unfortunately, our family and friends, as well as most of our hometown residents, will be watching. Lynn will watch in her room under the excuse that she is too tired to watch with me. There was really nothing I could do to stop her. As I said earlier, she was old enough to understand what was going on. Despite this, we seem to have an unwritten and unspoken rule of no longer watching the cable version together. While the network show may have been awkward to watch together, the cable version was as close to adult films as it could get without actual nudity. They blurred the nudity, but it looked like Sherry's best moments were under the covers. Nothing much happened until half an hour into the show when Sherry was on the outdoor couch, smoking with her lover. Harley, the other idiot, was this the same woman I married? Jake then whispered to my wife to join him in bed. She blushed and smiled sweetly, and every wrong step she took tore me apart. He then stood up and offered his hand to help my wife up, like the true gentleman he would never be. Still holding her hand, he led her into the kitchen, where the rest of the house was sitting around the counter talking. Everyone was shocked by the brazenness of this idiot as he led my wife past them like a sheep to the slaughter or a virgin being defenselessly offered up for sacrifice. She looked so vulnerable, so sweet and innocent, that part of me still wanted her to be mine, even though I could never live with her betrayal, a betrayal that was not yet complete. Sherry followed him upstairs to his room, her gentle hand in his, as the remaining members of the house looked on with disgust. Step by step, he took over my wife, and I could do nothing. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't understand what was going on in her head. She did look a little timid, perhaps unsure if she was doing the right thing, but there was no resistance, and there was a sparkle in her eyes that indicated her excitement at being alone with him. The feeling in my stomach told me that new indelible images would soon emerge to add to my collection of sadness. Would you say just to look away? Believe me, it's not that simple. I wanted more than anything to turn away, but something pulled me. It was the same with Lynn, perhaps it was just a temporary lapse of common sense. I really didn't know. It didn't take long before they reached his room. He stripped without anything, and the producers smeared what was necessary. The cable version was virtually unedited, especially the audio, but the video was a different story. The blurry part saved it from becoming an adult film but didn't leave much to the imagination. After a few minutes, he asked her if he was giving her more pleasure than me, and she nodded and smiled. After a few more questions, he asked one that I never would have thought of in a million years. It was intended to bring the completely helpless husband to the breaking point. He asked, in a fake caring tone, "Have you ever had an affair?" "What do you mean, like an old romance?" This caught both his and my attention for the same reason, that she didn't deny it outright and wanted to clarify before answering. He grinned, and I felt like I was going to get sick again. It could have been a heart attack, or just vomiting, or perhaps both, but something had to happen. In fact, if I had been offered a fatal heart attack at that moment, I would have gladly accepted it and said thank you. She then admitted that she had an affair with one of her colleagues while they were traveling to out-of-town conferences. She said she slept with him every night they were gone. Thinking back, I remembered how she only made a couple of trips a year for 4 or 5 nights. When Jake pressed her, she admitted that the affair had lasted about 3 years, and the excitement she felt that first night far outweighed any guilt she might have felt. She also said that by the end of the conference, she couldn't wait for the next one. When he asked if there was anyone else, she admitted that she had dated one of our married neighbors a few times in the past year, but it had never been serious. My heart sank again. Then he asked the question that nearly gave me a heart attack, which I was now openly rooting for. Have you ever done this in bed with your husband? You mean the neighbor? Yes. He was always in our bed at home. He didn't really make enough money to rent a room, and I couldn't risk using my credit card and leaving a paper trail in your husband's bed. It's pretty, yeah. I have to admit it was pretty exciting. We mostly met during the day, and the possibility of getting caught always enhanced the experience. Wow, this is cool. While your husband works hard for his family, you made your neighbor comfortable in your marital bed. He grinned. Now, for some reason, he was poking into her business. I began to believe that he was a sadist. He then asked, has your neighbor ever visited you while your husband was out with your daughter? What do you mean? Well, you told me that your daughter played softball in high school. Did your lover come and do it in your bed while hubby was at her game? She shook her head and made a sound, no. I held my breath and exhaled loudly when she answered, relieved that she wasn't so heartless. However, my relief was short-lived as a moment later she added something that made my heart stop. It happened when my husband volunteered to be an escort at my daughter's graduation. My neighbor came, and from Lynn's room, I heard a scream. That damn part of me wanted to call her and tell her not to talk about her mother in those terms, but who the hell am I kidding? The kid got his way. Lynn's scream drew my attention away from Sherry's confession for a few moments, but soon what little sense I had left returned to me, and I pieced together what I had just heard. In fact, my first thought was, do I even know my wife? After all, not once on the night of my daughter's graduation did I think she was home knocking boots with the married neighbor. I never thought I had a reason for this. Speaking of graduation, did I mention that it was only a few weeks before the damn reality show started, and that she refused help because she wasn't feeling well? No, I didn't mention this before, did I? And if you're wondering if I know who the neighbor was, the answer is no. I wish I did, though. Then I watched as they were about to have a night. I heard things being thrown in Lynn's room. I felt sorry for her. I wanted to hug her and tell her that everything would be fine and that everything would pass, but that would have been a lie of epic proportions. Moreover, what father would want to be in the same room with his daughter under such circumstances? The floodgates opened, and a stream of tears flowed down my face. Did any of this turn me on? Absolutely not, and I knew I would never be able to erase the images from my memory, which made me doubt if I would ever be able to touch a woman again. I was crushed beyond repair, and that fatal heart attack I had hoped for was sounding better and better. Although my time in our family home was suddenly coming to an end, the thought of spending another night in our bed seemed disgusting to me. Instead, I fell asleep on the couch. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to the bathroom but found myself covered with a blanket. My daughter must have visited me at some point and covered me up for her dear old dad. She still loved me and cared about me, and damn, I needed that. When I returned to the couch after my bathroom break, I sat there for a while, thinking about how much I was going to miss Lynn when she went off to college in Maine this year. But at least I didn't shed tears for this. I couldn't if I tried. I cried all the time. The show returned the next night, and it just so happened to be Jake's last night as leader of the house. I didn't care at all about the game, about who won or who left, with the exception of 3 people. Even then, the damage was done, but I couldn't help but watch. In that sense, I think I was as bad as the rest of America. About half an hour into the show, host Katie Ross gathered the players in the America's Watching Lounge, where she asked a few houseguests a few questions. She started with Sherry and asked her if she felt guilty for putting herself in compromising positions with certain young men on the show. Sherry started giggling, and Jake hugged her as she explained that she and her husband had discussed the possibility of something like this happening and that he was okay with it as long as it remained part of the show and that she would be his faithful wife when she returned. The host then asked if that meant she and her husband had an open marriage, to which Sherry giggled again and replied, "I guess you could say that." At home, Lynn, who was lying on the floor watching the network version with me, turned and asked, "Dad?" Unable to speak, I simply shook my head and stared at the screen in anger and disbelief, watching as my once faithful wife continued to strike at my heart. Lynn turned back to the TV, satisfied that my silent answer meant her mother was lying and that I would never agree to such a thing. We realized that her mother was caught up in the hype and excitement of the show. Even when others talked about their families to tears, her reaction was not so sincere. She rarely mentioned family, and when she did, It seemed as if she was talking about some shared family rather than her own. Lynn later told me that she saw her mother look at Jake with love, and it filled her with shock and disgust. Her heart was breaking, and she couldn't even imagine how devastated I was. She admitted that she wanted to turn and look at me to make sure I was okay, but she was afraid of what she might see. After a few minutes of hearing several sobs, she stood up and left the room. She was well aware that her world, and in fact her family's world, had changed forever, and that nothing would ever be the same again. She knew that her mother, her incredibly stupid and selfish mother, was the only culprit. Despite arguing with her mother in the past over minor issues, this week was the first time she thought of her as a villain. I was already dead inside, and Lynn knew it, even though we both understood there was nothing anyone could do about it. And then there was a cable broadcast that same night. As I said, this was Jake's last night as leader of the house, and in baseball terms, I was expecting a fastball when fate decided to throw me a curveball. The expected fastball would have been bad enough, but the curveball hit hard, and what it broke was my will to live. Jake and Harley made a deal. If Harley promised not to put Jake up for eviction, he would help Harley bond with the once loyal and loving suburban housewife who had become his plaything in the house. Jake said he was going to lie down for a while and looked at Sherry with a grin, which was a clear invitation to join him. She waited a few minutes before getting up and entering the house, saying that she was tired too. This move did not fool the remaining players, who looked at each other and continued calling her behind her back. She walked up the stairs and slowly opened the door, but didn't realize that Harley was waiting for her in Jake's bed in the dark room. Everything happened quickly. I heard the sound of breaking glass and immediately thought that Lynn had thrown something and broken it in her room. But when I looked at the liquid running down the living room wall, I realized it was I who threw my glass at the wall. In case you're wondering, it was a direct throw out of pure frustration. 2 nights later, on network air, some guy got kicked out, but who cares? Anyway, then it was time for the backyard competition or whatever it's called. Sherry won some games by answering more stupid questions than everyone else, becoming house leader for a week. No need for the backup plans we discussed with the network. Let's move on to plan A. After a commercial break, the host welcomed America back to the show. The group of 6 was sitting in the living room when Sherry was told she was allowed to receive a letter from home. I couldn't believe how excited she was, and it really seemed genuine. Why she was so happy, I couldn't say. After everything she went through on the show and even her 2 infidelities, you'd think reading a letter from her boring husband would be more of a chore than something enjoyable for her. Now, I don't mean to brag, but I really outdid myself with this letter and could only hope that Sherry would appreciate the time and effort that went into it. Katie Ross, the host, said, "We have a surprise guest here who will deliver your letter." Sherry put her hands to her lips in surprise and asked, "Is it Walt or my daughter Lynn?" At that moment, a man in a suit came through the door, walked up to her, and asked, "Are you Sherry and Carpenter?" Thinking it was still part of the show, she giggled and replied, "Yes, I'm Sherry and Carpenter." He handed her a large manila envelope and said, "You have been served with a subpoena." There was a loud gasp from the studio audience watching outside the house, as apparently the presenter had not been warned in advance about what would happen. There was even applause, which for some reason made me happy. Everyone seemed to be in shock except for Jake and Harley, who simply looked at the camera and grinned. Sherry began to cry and lose control, but being the caring lover that he is, Jake came over to comfort my wife. He hugged her, held her close, and began to whisper in her ear in a soothing tone. Although I was far from Los Angeles, I still managed to wipe the grin off Jake and Harley's faces for at least a moment when they also received a manila envelope. Of course, their envelopes were intended for a claim for alienation of affection. Their relief only lasted a few minutes as they voted to evict 2 people from the show that night. Some women got kicked out, then another competition took place, and Harley won. While all this was happening, it was clear that Sherry was visibly shaken. She was just going through the motions, not knowing what to do or what was more important, the show or her marriage. In my opinion, she should have tried to win the show because her marriage was already over, but it wasn't to be. After Sherry was one of the 2 people nominated for eviction, she was sent to the banquet house, where she had to wait until the last night to vote for the winner. It was not an easy night. Sherry metaphorically punched me in the face so many times that I lost count, but she was also punched on the way out. The deciding secret vote to evict her was cast by none other than her love interest on the show, Jake. I guess he didn't need her in the house anymore, and she was stopping him from winning $500,000 in House of Feasts. She was joined by Jake, who was eliminated the following week. The feast house doesn't have many cameras, but while the evicted guests sat in the living room, Sherry sat on the love seat with Jake, not only next to her but with his arm around her. When the host asked if they continued their romance in the new house, Jake immediately and proudly stated that they had decided to share a bed and that last night was probably the best night of his life. What a scoundrel. There are no cameras in the bedrooms in the House of Feasts, so even if I assumed they continued their dirty deeds, I might not know for sure. But when Sherry looked down and blushed, I knew it was true. God help me, I realized it was true. She continued the affair in the House of Feasts. There is no excuse because, for her, the game is already over. She had nothing more to achieve. Not that her actions could be justified within the framework of the game, but even her twisted logic could not explain the continuation of the affair after her elimination from the game. It was another blow to the face. I thought this was the final blow, but believe it or not, there was even worse to come. Finally, the night of the final show arrived. They introduced the members of the House of Feasts, and as they came out one by one to loud applause from the audience, they enjoyed the last moments of their 15 minutes of fame. However, not every greeting was loud and enthusiastic. When Harley came out, the applause was polite at best, with a few shouts. He was clearly not happy with this turn of events. Jake came out next, and as the booing increased, he began looking around to see if anyone was about to attack him. His smirk disappeared as it became clear that he was being seen as the bad guy. Really, what did he expect? Sherry was then introduced, and she came out in front of a live audience. She was greeted with a few faint applause and some shouts, but mostly there was silence. I couldn't help but think that indifference was worse than catcalls. She sat down on the stool next to Jake, but he didn't try to hug her. Did the lovebirds really have a quarrel? I hope that wasn't the case because they seemed like such a cute couple and had great chemistry. That would be a real shame, wouldn't it? Her eyes scanned the crowd as if she expected to see her husband and daughter there, but this did not happen. Lynn was already settling into her hostel in Maine, and it was my third night in my new apartment in Dan, Florida. The host behaved professionally with Sherry throughout the entire show, even though it was obvious that neither she nor the audience approved of my wife's actions. This brought me some comfort, but by then, I was practically inconsolable. In the end, some won, some lost, and the show generated the network's highest ratings of all time, second only to that year's Super Bowl. Who cares? Sherry eventually contacted my daughter, and Lynn told me what happened after the last show. After unsuccessfully trying to reach Lynn and me from her hotel in Los Angeles, she attempted to contact her parents and sister, but the result was the same. Sherry's family didn't intend to disown her completely, but they apparently needed time to process what had happened over the last 3 months and weren't ready to take her calls. She later told Lynn that when no one answered her calls, she began to realize how much she had screwed up her life. How she hadn't seen this before is incredible. Damn, there were red flags even before she left the house that fateful morning a few months ago to get into that damn limo. When Sherry arrived at our airport, hoping that we would meet her, she found herself completely alone. She actually had the nerve to be mad at me for not meeting her. Of course, she took a taxi home and found the house dark, with Lynn's things and my things missing from our closets. Sherry told Lynn that she burst into tears on the spot and fell asleep right there on the bedroom floor. My daughter was the one who called me a few weeks later to tell me that her 42-year-old mother was pregnant. Hearing this should have made me happy as a husband, but not in this case. Simple arithmetic showed that I was not the father. It could only be Jake or Harley. And here it comes, the final blow to the face. It took a while to get there, but as I told you earlier, the worst was yet to come. I was already through with my wife, however, my daughter was still hoping for some kind of relationship with her mother. Well, her pregnancy put an end to that. Sherry Carpenter was truly a master at alienating loved ones, friends, and even acquaintances. No one could take that away from her. Not exactly a gift from above, but it is what it is. For all her misdeeds that led to these record ratings, all she received for her lost marriage and the alienation of her once loving husband and daughter was just $5,000. Jake and Harley continued their brotherly relationship after the show ended, with Harley moving to Atlanta to share a bachelor pad with Jake. Sherry gave birth to a baby girl 3 months ago, and a DNA test showed that Jake was the biological father. As expected, he denied any responsibility. Even though Jake was a complete loser, his family had money, and they used it to dismiss my alienation of affection claims against him and Harley. My lawyer warned me that this could happen, but it was worth it to shake their cages and expose them as the scoundrels they were. Their lawyers also managed to convince the judge that Sherry lured poor Jake into him as part of a game called America is Watching. In the end, Sherry got nothing and faced even more attacks from the media, especially daytime talk shows and syndicated variety shows. I followed the further developments with some interest. Lynn is cautious about a possible relationship with her new sister. I don't think anyone can blame her for that. She says that although she has nothing against the child, she just can't bring herself to meet her yet. Lynn admitted that much of her resistance stems from the fact that she is not yet ready to see her mother. Although they talk on the phone from time to time, Lynn has no plans to visit her anytime soon. Lynn says phone conversations are short but not short enough for her. I also have nothing against the baby and was glad to hear that she was born healthy and happy, and I wish her all the best, but that topic no longer interests me. This subject is no longer open for discussion with anyone, anywhere. I believe that the story I have just told justifies my reluctance to speak on this topic. At this point, it is only fair to sum it up and tell you how my meeting with the court-appointed psychiatrist, psychologist, or whoever ended. This will also include her opinion and not just my thoughts. I can say that at first I was wary of her, but by the end of our long session, I began to respect and even sympathize with her. Anyway, Dr. Nancy Royce listened carefully to my story but said little as she invited me into her office and asked me to tell my side of the story. Now I was just summing it up in the doctor's office by saying that America is Watching became a ratings bomb and a hot topic for a few weeks after the show ended, but eventually, all the noise died down and people moved on with their lives, while our personal nightmare was almost forgotten by the majority. However, there are those of us who will live with this for the rest of our lives. It was far from a game for us, and if I had known then what I know now, I would have superglued Sherry's feet to our living room floor. The doctor smiled slightly. Who knows, maybe if it weren't for the show, I would never have found out about the other 2 infidelities, and we would still be married. On the other hand, if she had cheated before and was willing to cheat on national television, well, I really don't know what to believe. In any case, since she returned home, she has tried in every possible way to delay the divorce. I hope that she will just leave things as they are. Not only will I never talk to her again, but I'm not going to ever be in the same room with her. This should give you some idea of my feelings towards a possible reconciliation. At our last court hearing, the judge scheduled us to see Dr. Nancy Royce. Of course, my lawyer told me about this since he is handling the entire divorce in my absence. And here I am, doctor. Although I have to tell you, counseling is the last thing I wanted because there is no way I will ever be able to take Sherry back. The first time she disrespectfully kissed that loser, I knew it was over. But at least you're here, Mr. Carpenter. Well, this or prison. There won't be a next time, I replied. Would you rather go to jail? Not really, but something like that. Her expression became serious, but she left it without comment. She leaned forward and began, Mr. Carpenter, I asked you to tell your story as honestly as possible, and I must admit I was very impressed with you. How the hell did I do that? Let's just say I'm glad I asked the judge to schedule an individual session with you. I know you wouldn't be so outspoken if your wife were present. Because if my wife was here, I'd still be in Florida. However, you have been very open with me, and I really appreciate it. I have to admit that usually husbands come into my office, swear at their wives, and blame them for everything that is wrong in their marriage. But you didn't do that. She paused for a moment before continuing. No, Mr. Carpenter, you were focused more on your emotions and your daughter's emotions. It was very revealing and helped gain my trust. I didn't know I had to gain your trust. She laughed and said, this is the best way. That's why I booked such a long session. I really wanted to meet you, and I think we succeeded." She paused again and then added, "Do you mind if I present my theory about why your wife behaved the way she did? Were you able to form your humble opinion based solely on court records and one meeting with my wife? From my point of view, this is not enough." "No, Mr. Carpenter. My humble opinion, as you put it, is not based solely on the notes provided to me by the judge in your divorce case or from one meeting with Mrs. Carpenter. In fact, I've been working with your wife for almost a year now." This surprised me. "I don't want to offend you, doctor, but this looks like a setup. Believe me, this is not true. Let's leave it at that. Sherry knows that I will talk to you soon and told me that I can reveal everything that we have talked about so far." "Maybe," I simply nodded. She sensed that I was not very enthusiastic about listening to something like weak excuses or psychological jargon. She understood this and quickly added, "I know you are skeptical, Mr. Carpenter, and no, I am not suggesting that you accept what I am about to present as an excuse for your wife's actions. In fact, I am not going to suggest that you accept any explanation for your wife's actions. All I ask is that you remain open and listen to me. Can you do this for me?" I simply nodded for her to continue. "Mr. Carpenter, there's no doubt that Sherry was in a perfect storm. It all started with the very idea of participating in the show, and from that moment on, everything took its course. She wasn't just a fan who loved watching the show. Your wife seems to have lived for the sake of participating in this series. In her mind, from the moment she was chosen to participate in America is Watching, she was in a fantasy world. When she opened her mailbox on that fateful day, she essentially became a different person. We are working hard to understand why she allowed herself to become such a different person. She took the cap off the water bottle and took a sip. I have a possible explanation, or explanations, for why she could get so close to this man while she was away from you. While I am the first to admit that we have yet to find the definitive answer we are all looking for, I believe we are moving in the right direction." I remained silent as she continued. "This is a very difficult situation, and I am afraid that everything I say will be difficult to hear." "Continue," I said, clearing my throat, although I immediately doubted the correctness of my decision. I had heard of similar cases before, although I admitted that I had never seen it happen so quickly. "I have a theory about this, but perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself." Then I said with a smile, "Come on, doctor, lay it on me. I have a business." She realized that my remark was just friendly banter, so she smiled and continued. "Mr. Carpenter, I believe that your wife had difficulty distinguishing the reality of this television show from reality itself. I believe that deep down, she missed you terribly but could not find a way to express her regret for leaving you." "Seriously? Did she miss me and become Jake's wife?" She leaned back and smiled slightly. "You're very perceptive, because that's what I mean." "Oh, come on, doctor. She is a grown woman. She knew what was right and what was wrong. Perhaps not in the way you might expect. I think she clung to him in your absence. As you said, she became his wife while she was on the show. It made her feel secure and loved at home with you and your daughter. So why didn't she adopt a daughter to complement her new husband?" She laughed a little before replying, again, very insightful. I was confused and demonstrated this with my next brilliant question. "You're on the right track." I rewatched the whole season and noticed she was getting close to one young woman, even though she was on the other team or whatever it's called. She became a motherly figure until she got kicked out of the show early on. I believe that by temporarily hosting a new family, she was able to cope with the stress of being on the show. But she wanted to be on the show. After all, that's what she lived for. I agree, but subconsciously, she probably felt enormous guilt for leaving you and your daughter. This Jake and this young girl gave her back a sense of comfort that she had been missing in her life. Was that supposed to calm me down, doctor? She just shook her head, giving me time to think about it. Before I said, so in a way, she was trying to replace her family? This is right, on a purely temporary basis. Unfortunately, when the show ended, reality hit her right between the eyes. She didn't understand that what she was doing was wrong, even if it was temporary. And of course, I didn't understand how it might look from the outside. Just look at how deaf she was to most of her housemates' comments. I wasn't sure I agreed with everything she said and thought it was an exaggeration at best, but it was probably plausible, at least to some extent. After a long pause, she said, "There is another possibility, and frankly, it is something that could either play a role in what I just laid out or work independently of it. In any case, I certainly am not going to do you or your wife any favors by telling you this." I asked the obvious question, "What is this, doctor?" She hesitated and took a deep breath. "There is a possibility that at some point, she completely fell out of love with you." She read the sadness on my face. I'd never thought about it myself. In fact, I'd often assumed it was the reason for her actions, or at least part of the reason. But hearing it from someone qualified to make such assessments stung. "Please, Mr. Carpenter, there is a good chance that this is not the case. You yourself said that until the day she opened the mailbox, there were no problems between you except for periodic quarrels. Moreover, her falling out of love with you does not explain how she could leave her daughter, not to mention her sister and parents. But separation would help explain her other infidelities, wouldn't it?" Shaking her head, she replied, "Not necessarily, but it can't be ruled out. It's hard to say for sure." "Well, that probably almost explains it, in a way." She laughed good-naturedly. "Sorry, Mr. Carpenter, this was clearly not my most, let's say, convincing answer. You see, doctor, watching her get seduced on national television was bad enough, wasn't it? But then I had to calmly listen to her, well, calmly tell her new lover about her previous infidelities. Damn! I heard her reading the shopping list with great excitement, and she never showed a hint of remorse. I knew she was being teased then, but she still calmly confessed. I stopped, took a deep breath, and then added, "How can someone do something like that to a person they love?" The answer is, you can't. And if she cheated during our marriage, it means she never really loved me. There was almost a minute of silence. Finally, she broke it. "I would tell you in small steps, Mr. Carpenter, that we are in the early stages of Mrs. Carpenter's treatment." "I would be lying if I said I had all the answers," admitted the doctor. "You're also not sure that she still loves me, are you?" She thought for a few moments before giving a balanced answer. "Well, I think she likes the idea of marrying you, Mr. Carpenter." "I wish you would say more." "Me too, Mr. Carpenter." "Me too." I shook my head. Most people don't find out about their spouses cheating on national television, so when you think about it, there's nothing real about reality TV, is there? No, there isn't. And I'm afraid Mrs. Carpenter will find out the hard way. There was an awkward silence, followed by an even more awkward conversation. "I'll be happy to help you, too. I would like to ease your pain and perhaps restore your marriage." I sat looking at her diplomas hanging on the wall and didn't know what to say. "Mr. Carpenter, I have already told you that my work with your wife is far from over, but I truly believe that she can return to the woman you fell in love with and married." "Why?" Sherry was clearly never the woman I considered my wife, was she? I answered her sharply. I paused for a moment before continuing. "Don't get me wrong, this is not revenge on my wife. I don't wish anything bad on her, really. And if you think you can help her, I say go ahead. But you'll have to do it without me. I don't care. I'm dead inside." After another silence, I added, "Please, doctor, my daughter and I have suffered enough. The whole thing was pure torture, and it seems like the only person anyone really cares about is the one who caused it all. What about Lynn and me? I don't want to be selfish, but how the hell are we supposed to move on with our lives? How's Lynn holding up?" As you know, Lynn is attending college in another state and is adjusting as well as one would expect. I'm very grateful for this. She still has friends back home, but she also has new friends, and her life is getting better. I don't know what the future holds for her, but she has proven that she is a very resilient young lady. How are you doing, Mr. Carpenter? How are you holding up? Were you able to move on? I hesitated, searching for an answer. It wasn't easy. I'm trying, doctor. I really am trying. You already know that I moved to Florida before the show ended, and I'm still there. I couldn't stay in our hometown. Everyone was kind to me, but to see those pitying glances everywhere I went. I fell silent, not bothering to finish or continue my thought. My lawyer does everything he can, but sometimes it's impossible. Like this consultation, I had to fly here, and I will have to do that for any future sessions. Wouldn't it be worth it if we could save your marriage? It won't work. There's nothing to save. She gave up everything to participate in a TV show. What kind of petty act is this? And on top of that, she also insists that my daughter and I forgive her for wanting to fulfill her dream. Now she can appear in any other reality show or live with some handsome young man who will turn her head. I won't stop her anymore. In a caring voice, she asked, despite everything that has happened, do you still love your wife, Mr. Carpenter? I took a deep breath and sighed before repeating the question and answering, do I still love my wife? Yes, I love her. But she is dead to me. She cocked her head to the side like a puppy who doesn't understand a command. I must say, this is a very interesting point of view. I don't remember anyone saying they loved a person and, at the same time, declaring that person was dead to them. Could you explain this more? It's actually not that hard to understand. Have you ever had someone close to you die? Someone you really loved? Yes. But have you stopped loving them? Dr. Roy smiled slightly and simply replied, no. I looked at my hands and continued, I still have some kind of love for her and always will. I can't just turn it off, no matter how much I want to. But eventually, I accepted that I had lost her. It breaks my heart, and it took time, but I got over it. She is no longer mine, and as it turns out, she never fully was. I took a break to collect my thoughts, and she gave me the time and space to do so. Everything might not have been so if I had not seen it with my own eyes. All this. Damn. I would never have known about her cheating if I hadn't looked. I mean, I think someone else might have told me, but my voice faded again. She sat and watched me struggle with my thoughts before finally breaking the silence. I know you said it was hard to tear yourself away from the broadcast, Mr. Carpenter, but can you tell me why you wanted to watch it so much? I didn't want to watch. God knows I didn't want to, but I couldn't turn away. It was like watching one of those wildlife shows where you see a cute zebra about to be grabbed by a lion. You want to stop this somehow. You scream at the TV to warn the poor defenseless animal about the impending danger, but you can't do anything, and you can't look away. Cherry was the prey, and that man was the predator, and there was nothing I could do about it except watch. Perhaps in time, if the judge grants a divorce, you will be able to find someone special. I shook my head. I don't think so, doctor. Perhaps over time, the pain will subside. I hope so, but I'm not sure about these images, those damn pictures of Sherry with those guys. My mind even makes me imagine her with the guys from her 2 novels, and that's just my imagination. I don't understand how I can ever trust another woman again. No offense, of course. No hard feelings, but you know the news said that the internet is flooded with letters from all over the world from women wanting to meet you. Exactly what I need, a chance to let another woman down. You can't be serious about this. I cannot. You heard what she said about me to the whole world. I stopped, and Dr. Roy didn't interrupt me, giving me time to finish my thoughts. I said in a broken voice, I will never forget how they planned her seduction and how they carried it out while I watched helplessly from 3,000 miles away. All this time, I couldn't do anything about it. Nothing. But the worst part wasn't the foreplay or the night or even the fact that I found out about the other cheating. I choked up, trying to say what I wanted without bursting into tears. My voice trembled from the very beginning to the end. The moment when my heart really stopped, when I wanted to die, was not about Intim, not about finding out about the betrayal. This was the moment when my wife, the only lover I had ever known and the mother of my daughter, allowed another man to lead her around the room like a sacrificial lamb, showing the world, especially me, that she now belonged to someone else. Then to see the look of anticipation in her eyes as she followed that idiot up the stairs to his bedroom toward the end of our marriage, and to know that she wasn't thinking about me at all. I finished the sentence bitterly. And now some judge, a complete stranger who doesn't really understand the situation, thinks that it's better for us to kiss, make up, and forget about the past. So tell me, doctor, will my life turn upside down once a week for the sake of some meaningless consultations? No offense, of course. She didn't say anything, just looked at her notes. I couldn't help but think that at that moment, she would rather be anywhere but here. So, Dr. Roy, here's my story. You wanted to hear it, and here it is. Do whatever you want with it, but know that if you suggest another meeting, especially one involving my wife, you and she will be disappointed. Honestly, I'd rather commit suicide than talk to her again. And if it comes down to it, I'll do it. It's not a threat, it's just a fact. I felt a tear roll down my cheek as the effects of reliving my personal nightmare intensified. She looked at me for almost a minute without saying a word. It was clear that she was trying to gauge my resolve before she finally returned to her notes and slowly shook her head. Then she leaned back in her large leather chair and pressed the fingertips of both hands together as if she were praying. She hesitated but finally said, "I don't think it's necessary to give you additional sessions, Mr. Carpenter." Then she leaned forward, folding her hands and meeting my gaze. "I agree with you. I think you and your daughter have been through enough in the last year that I honestly don't know anyone who could handle it, let alone forgive and forget. In many ways, you are an amazing person, Mr. Carpenter." "I don't feel amazing. Hell, I don't feel anything at all." She paused before adding, "I will inform the court that the marriage is beyond repair. I sincerely hope that you can improve your life, at least for the sake of your daughter." I just nodded my head and breathed a quiet sigh of relief that someone other than my daughter had finally taken my feelings into account. "Before you go, Mr. Carpenter, there are a couple of things I'd like to discuss." She looked at me again and began, "You are not trying to harm your wife physically or financially. In fact, besides keeping your retirement account and car, you gave your wife everything else, including the house, her car, and all the bank accounts. That's very impressive, Mr. Carpenter. Let me tell you that your wife was pleasantly surprised and appreciates it very much." I nodded in recognition. She suffered enough. She was rejected by her own parents, all our friends, and almost all of America. I don't want to cause her more pain than she already has. Even though I can't be around her anymore, I just want to get out of this. Thank you for understanding." I paused for a moment before adding, "Doctor, I haven't known you for so long, but I trust you probably more than I should. If I ask you a question, will you give me an honest answer?" She looked me in the eye and said, "Yes, Mr. Carpenter. If I know the answer, I will." "You were very frank with me, and I think I owe it to you." I nodded and continued, "I noticed that you were wearing a wedding ring." She smiled. "Yes, I do, Mr. Carpenter, but I guess that's not the question you want answered." I smiled sadly. "Now you are perceptive." She laughed. "To your health," I replied, then added, "I just want to know if your husband was on the show and did to you what Sherry did to me. All things being equal, including the reasons you think are possible." I stopped, and she completed my question. "Would you forgive him and take him back?" I smiled sadly and nodded. She smiled back, shook her head, and said, "No way. I can see how this has destroyed you, and I'll tell you honestly, I wouldn't have reacted any differently than you did." She hesitated before adding, "I know this is only one side of the story, but in this case, I can see the recording of what happened, so I don't have to take your word for it. I also saw this with my own eyes. I just needed to gauge your emotions. Moreover, your wife confessed to most of what happened." She paused, then said, "I don't know how to approach this, Mr. Carpenter, so I'll just say that there are things that bother me about the implications of all this. Could you stay a little longer and talk to me about this? I promise that this will not affect my decision in any way, and that everything we talk about will remain between us, if you want medical confidentiality." She stopped and took a sip of water, making me wonder where this conversation was going. I actually had a pretty good idea, but I was hoping it wouldn't come up. I shrugged, then nodded for her to continue. "There were several incidents mentioned in the court case where authorities initially considered you a suspect." She looked up, but I remained calm and silent. She continued, looking through her notes. "The first incident happened with one of your neighbors shortly before you moved to Florida. One night, he was attacked while leaving a bowling alley. He initially told police he recognized you as his attacker, although his wife claimed it was two much shorter men." She looked up, hoping for a reaction, but there was none. She continued, "The police report states that his wife repeatedly mentioned that her husband was having an affair with an unknown woman from the area." I was silent. You were never questioned because your wife was sure it wasn't you. A few days later, her husband changed his story and told the police that there were two short men. I sat quietly. Another incident in the case involves two men from the reality TV show America is Watching, who were found seriously beaten in an alley outside a nightclub in Atlanta. She paused for a moment, gauging my reaction, which was non-existent. I wouldn't know about it. I don't really watch the news. Life is complicated enough without making other people's problems juxtapose your own. Dr. Roy smiled and continued. I read that they wanted to question you as a suspect, Mr. Carpenter, but even though you matched the description of the attacker, you had an impeccable alibi. I said nothing again. According to the story, you were on a friend's boat in the Florida Keys all weekend when the attacks occurred. You didn't tell me that you had a new friend in Florida and that your friend was a local judge. Well, you didn't ask, but this is not a secret, especially after it was published in the newspapers. He is a good friend, and we have a lot in common. His wife also cheated on him and then tried to destroy him. It's not exactly the same situation I found myself in, but I think mine is a little unique. She continued to smile. You know, I want to remind you of medical confidentiality. With a slight smile, I simply replied, okay. This definitely won't be my biggest professional moment, so I hope you don't think any less of me. I just really wanted these three to get theirs and for the good guy to win. She paused, searching for words. I don't know how to ask this, but this is what intrigued me the most. I have this feeling in my stomach, and I just want you to confirm. She stopped, as if hesitant to ask a question that might be inappropriate. It was my turn to finish her sentence. Confirm that I was the one who put Jake Harley and my neighbor in their place. She nodded slightly. I got up from the chair, turned around, and took a few steps toward the door. I stopped, turned to her, and saw the disappointment in her eyes as she looked at me, almost desperately searching for the answer she so wanted to hear. I took a deep breath and said with a hint of satisfaction, always trust your gut. She smiled wider than I could have imagined and said, I wish you all the best, Mr. Carpenter. Tell your daughter she has a wonderful father. My smile was much more modest but sincere when I replied, take care of yourself, doctor. I walked out of her office and into what was left of my life. What do you think of our concluding part of the story? I found it very interesting and unusual because I have never seen such a story before, and I like the fact that my husband knew everything from the beginning to the end. What was your impression? Write in the comments. Until new videos.